All right, hello folks. Welcome to the second session. My name is Christina Larson. I'm a Bernard Schwartz Fellow here at the New America Foundation and an editor at Foreign Policy Magazine. Well, I first want to thank all the earlier speakers and Jeff for doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the science. For purposes of the second panel, we're going to presume the question is not can we do this, but should we? How do we even begin to answer that question? And I'm going to frame the topic of the second panel a little bit more broadly than what's in the syllabus to just focus on the question of what's next. Because I think until we know what it is we're deploying and all the different things that could be talked about, it's a little bit hard to talk about the consequences, although, of course, that will be a part of this discussion. So from the first panel, we may be wondering whether we should be worried about China or the Maldives Island or Richard Branson being the first to put some of these ideas into action. My money might be on Richard Branson, but they don't pay me to make those guesses. But seriously, to begin to talk about how decisions should be made and what questions should be asked and who should be involved, I think we need a better sense of what some of the possible scenarios are. And I want to really drill down to trying to put forward some concrete scenarios for us to talk about. I think it'll help us to focus and to have a sort of a more productive discussion. And so the first thing to ask is also sort of what is it that we're afraid of? And also, are there any existing laws that are pertinent, the law of the sea, anything signed at Kyoto or at Copenhagen that would bear upon some of these questions? So here to help us answer some of those is Dan Badansky, our first speaker. Dan is the Lincoln Professor of Law, Ethics, and Sustainability at Arizona State University. He has worked in the State Department and also as the Climate Change Coordinator during the latter years of the Clinton administration, which he may tell us a little bit about. I understand it gave him an inside look into the negotiating process, and I don't know if he's more optimistic or not afterwards, but I'll let him take it from here. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. So Christina asked me, first of all, to talk a little bit about what international law currently says about geoengineering, and it's a pretty simple answer, which is not much. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change doesn't say anything directly about geoengineering. The 1977 Environmental Modification Treaty is sometimes raised about this issue, but it's limited to the use of environmental modification for hostile or military purposes, so it wouldn't be addressing geoengineering for peaceful purposes. To the extent geoengineering affects biodiversity, then the Biological Diversity Convention is relevant, and as some of you know, the parties to the Biological Diversity Convention adopted a moratorium decision on ocean fertilization experiments. But I think it's important to remember that that's not legally binding. The parties cannot adopt legally binding decisions. That's just their opinion. For them to adopt anything legally restricting the use of geoengineering would require an amendment to the convention or some kind of new protocol. The same is, I think, more or less true of the London Convention, which is the other convention that's come up in the geoengineering context. The London Convention deals with ocean dumping, so it's relevant to the dumping of, or the placement of various kinds of things into the ocean to promote carbon fertilization, carbon dioxide removal by the ocean. They've been addressing this, but it's under a quite broad provision in the London Convention that talks about countries trying to prevent all types of marine pollution. The specific regulatory remit of the London Convention is limited to dumping, and I think it's still considered an open question as to whether or not putting iron into the ocean for the purpose of fertilization would constitute dumping or not. And in order to address that again, that would require an amendment to the treaty. It would require some kind of regulatory action by the treaty, which hasn't taken place yet. So if we're talking about what does international law say about this, we're really writing essentially on a clean slate here. Now, I guess that is, in a sense, maybe of concern to some people. I guess the silver lining to that is that even if there were international law dealing with geoengineering, how effective it would be, I think, is an open question. As an international lawyer, you tend to be caught in a whipsaw where on the one hand, you come to Washington and a lot of people just don't believe in international law at all and think it's completely useless. And on the other hand, then there are people who are sort of a touching faith in the power of international law, so that if there's an international convention out there, that somehow is seen as being enough to solve the problem. And I think both points of view are incorrect, but I think the latter point of view tends to be the one that you see more often in the geoengineering debate, that if we could simply find some international treaty like the Environmental Modification Treaty that could somehow be applied to geoengineering, that would be enough to solve the problem. Okay, so the common tendency when there's a gap in international governance, like there is a gap right now dealing with the geoengineering, is to the answer seems to be, well, we need some kind of new international governance to deal with it. And then people sort of look and take ideas off the shelf, the conventional wisdom as to how to deal with international governance, and they say we need public participation, we need transparency, we need multilateral governance, yada, yada, yada. And they just sort of immediately jump into the conventional wisdom as to what good international governance consists of. But I think before we jump into that, we really need to think about why is international governance needed here? What kinds of functions might it be performing? And that then, I think, allows one to think better about what international governance might look like. Now, it's not immediately obvious that you need international governance to engage in geoengineering. You need international governance to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions because it's a collective action problem and individual countries are going to lack the incentive to reduce their emissions unless they have some confidence other countries are going to reduce their emissions as well. But as we've heard in the opening session and from David Keith, countries could engage in geoengineering unilaterally. So there's not a need for international governance for geoengineering to go forward. So we really, I think, need to think about, what then is the function of international governance, given that it's not a necessary condition for geoengineering. And I like to think about these kinds of problems in, I think, essentially the same way Jason did earlier, which is try to think about what are the scenarios we're concerned about, and then what kinds of problems do those raise, and then what kind of possible solutions are there. So my general analytical approach is going to be very similar to Jason's in the first panel. And let me outline just 4 basic scenarios quickly. It's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but I think it begins to get us to think about the kinds of governance challenges that geoengineering raises. So scenario 1 is what I call the premature rejection scenario. And this is the prospect that geoengineering raises huge alarm, leads to a moratorium or ban on geoengineering research. We've already seen some of this in the Biodiversity Convention moratorium discussions. And then for the immediate future, as a result, there's no research on geoengineering, so that if and when in subsequent years geoengineering becomes seen as useful or necessary even, we don't know much about what works and what doesn't work. We don't know which kinds of geoengineering might be safer or less safe. And here the problem really is overregulation. It's not underregulation, it's overregulation or premature regulation. And the governance challenge is somehow to develop a governance system that will forestall overregulation, to have moderate regulation now, which inspires public confidence so that we don't have a premature rejection. So that's one kind of governance challenge. Now, the second scenario is similar to the first in that the problem is inadequate research on geoengineering. But the problem isn't some premature rejection through regulation, it's lack of either public funding or private investment. A country, of course, could do geoengineering unilaterally if there was a sense of crisis, but there's not a sense of crisis in a lot of countries, primarily, most importantly, the US. So the government doesn't spend much on geoengineering. And I think this is essentially the situation in the US today. There's not a lot of research funding, so that most of the research funding on geoengineering comes now from private sources. Moreover, in this scenario, companies don't engage in much geoengineering research because geoengineering is basically providing a public good, and unless companies can get some private return from providing that public good, they're not going to be investing it. Now here the governance challenge is essentially to try to promote more government investment in basic research, possibly through some kinds of burden sharing or consortium arrangements with other countries, and to try to provide companies with some kinds of incentives to engage in geoengineering. And so this could be done, if we think of removing a ton of carbon from the atmosphere as equivalent to reducing a ton of emissions, like David Keith mentioned in his opening remarks, then we could give credits for removing carbon from the atmosphere through the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms or through individual national cap and trade systems, and that would then provide incentives for research to go forward. But here it's a very different kind of governance challenge to basically try to promote greater investments in R&D on geoengineering. Now, the third scenario is the so-called green finger scenario, where a private actor goes ahead with geoengineering on his or her own. And here the governance challenge is, how do we control private action? And this is essentially the same kind of problem that we have with terrorism. How do we control individual actors who can do things that might have a global effect? In my view, it's a much easier problem to deal with than terrorism, and it really probably doesn't raise such a serious issue, because even if someone like Bill Gates or Richard Branson were to build a fleet of ships to go around and try to do cloud whitening or inject sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere, it wouldn't be a single act that was causing it. It would be a continuous activity over time, which at least I assume would be possible to detect and respond to. So it would be very difficult for a private individual to be going ahead and doing this if governments wanted to shut them down. Nevertheless, there's still an international governance challenge, because there's the question, if someone were to try to do this, which governments would respond, who would have jurisdiction? If there wasn't something already understood about this, there's the potential for conflict. If you're doing something on the high seas, for example, or over the high seas from airplanes, there'd be jurisdictional questions about who would have the right to respond. It would be similar to the kinds of international challenges in responding to piracy, where there's a question as to who would be undertaking the action to try to prevent the private activity. So that's a third kind of scenario. And then the fourth, and I think by far the most troubling scenario, is the unilateral state action scenario, where geoengineering is undertaken by either an individual country or some consortium of countries. These were, I think, essentially spelled out in greater detail in 3 of Jason's, or maybe all 4 of Jason's scenarios in the first panel. There are different possible ways of thinking about what kind of individual country or group of countries might go forward with this. But I think it raises by far, obviously, the biggest governance challenges. If Russia were to engage in geoengineering even by itself, or China or the US, it's not so clear exactly how the international community would respond and how effective that kind of response would be. Here the problem is essentially akin to the problem internationally of trying to restrain the unilateral use of force by countries. And as we've seen over the last 60 years, despite a prohibition in the UN Charter on the unilateral use of force, except in self-defense, the international norms restricting the unilateral use of force have not been very effective over time. Now, these 4 scenarios raise very different kinds of governance challenges. In the essence, the first 2 involve a problem of too little geoengineering, and in the last 2 scenarios, there's a problem of too much geoengineering. So in the first 2 cases, the challenge is to try to encourage and facilitate geoengineering research. In the last 2, it's trying to prevent geoengineering activities either by private actors or by governments. The scenarios also differ in terms of who the target as to who you're trying to control is. In the first scenario, really, you're trying to control scientists in what they're doing through research. So your regulatory target is scientists. In the third scenario, it's individuals. And in the fourth scenario, it's governments. I think the first scenario is a lot easier because it's a lot easier to control scientific research activities. The fourth scenario is by far the most problematic because it's most problematic to try to control what states do. And then the scenarios also differ in terms of what the function of the international regime is, what the function would be. In the first, I think it would be largely to promote norms that promote public confidence in geoengineering research to prevent premature rejection. In the second, it's trying to do burden sharing and incentivization of activities. In the third scenario, controlling private actions, it's largely a function of allocating jurisdiction among states to control private behavior. And in the fourth, it's basically trying to develop some kind of international restraints on state action. So those are 4 quite different scenarios. I think they raise different kinds of governance challenge. I think we need to think about governing geoengineering not just in terms of different technologies, which David was talking about, which raise different problems, but also in terms of the different kinds of situations that we're concerned about and the kinds of ways to respond.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So in talking to the panelists about what they wanted to talk about, one thing that I did, I brainstormed with Sanjay on some questions that we should try to ask ourselves that would be applied to any of these different kinds of scenarios. What kinds of choices do we make? What kinds of trade-offs? How do we frame the questions that we should have answers to before moving forward in any kind of a way. And I asked him to think about that a little bit more and to expound upon some frameworks, and also to talk about where the mainstream environmental community is in terms of this discussion. We've heard from a lot of scientists. I think one thing we're very interested in learning more about here is who's beginning to speak pro, con, neutral, I don't know, to take positions publicly on these sets of issues. So our next speaker is Sanjay Yan. He is the lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy, where he specializes in human well-being, conservation, Africa, wildlife ecology, and media outreach. He is an American of South Asian descent, just back from a month or so of field research in Kenya, and so I think he brings a really valuable and unique perspective to this debate.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me out at this conference. The tragedy of this conversation is that climate change solutions or solving the global warming problem is really not that difficult, and we know what we need to do, and we have those solutions and technologies available in our hands right now. Nonetheless, when you think about humans, and this is the amazing thing about humans, is that we're always better at adapting to new things than restraining ourselves in any way, shape, or form. From the first moment of Genesis when God says, "Don't go eat that apple," what did we do? And that's always been the case, I think, with all the technologies we have. If we can imagine it, if we can conceive of it, we can experiment with it, we will inevitably end up trying it and using it, whether it works or not. So let's assume that geoengineering at grand scales at some point in the future, although we don't necessarily know why, is eventually going to happen. But that it won't be a panacea. It won't be the silver bullet. It'll be a silver buckshot approach. It'll be like any other thing, like nuclear technology or antibiotics, just one tool in a suite of tools that we will use ideally. And that's probably the best case scenario of how it might evolve in the future. So my thought then was, instead of debating whether or not trying to define the rules of how we might use it, at least as a society, sooner rather than later, something the environmental community is never very good at getting ahead of, always good at responding to it. And I just thought about, some of the ways in which that I would want, if I was heading the Nature Conservancy and I had before me a solution, or one of the solutions, and it was a geoengineering solution, how would I evaluate it and think about whether this is something that we want to support or not? And, I just listed out a half a dozen of these, and I thought I would just read them out to you as a point of beginning the discussion. And many of these have been touched on already by the previous speakers. And in no particular order, the first one you would want to think about would be the side effects or the cumulative effects of whatever you do. So whether it's reducing photosynthesis because you now are reducing the amount of sunlight coming in, whether it's taking away a blue sky, which people might value, or whether it's reducing the efficiencies of solar technologies we have on Earth today, which all depend on very small margins. Those are sort of three different ways in which something we do might have a side effect that we won't desire. The second is cost effectiveness. And we're always good at underestimating the cost of technological solutions. So that's why the back of the envelope calculation was great. At the same point, you sort of start thinking you nearly always underestimate it. Although, per unit cost might be different and technologies can do it. The third one would be how targeted is the solution. And is it something that deals with a broad suite of issues, or is it something that deals with just one thing but won't deal with, for example, ocean acidification, as was raised by the person from Oceania? The fourth factor I would consider would be reversibility, and to me that's actually a really big one. So the ability to reverse something if it wasn't producing the desired effect or had unintended consequences we didn't want to think about. And the trick with this is that things that last longer and thus have lower price per unit cost may not be the one thing that you actually want. So you might actually want something that doesn't last very long, simply because it allows you the ability to change it as it's being deployed. The fifth idea is risk of failure. And what I mean by this is that if you have a system and you are reliant on it quite heavily, and it has a catastrophic failure in it for some reason or another, then you are going to deal with a rapid jump in warming. So less time for adaptation, less time to prepare the Earth for things that are happening. All of a sudden, the switch gets turned off, and there's sort of mass panic and chaos. So the system, how is risk of failure in terms of any jump that you might see? And then the last one, and the one that I think I'm most passionate about, especially in this audience here, would be an issue of equity. So there will be winners and losers, no matter which one of these technologies you deploy. Winners in terms of those who will benefit materially from it, so make money out of it, and those as well as winners in terms of if it rains more here, it might rain less over there. And that's going to be a real challenge to deal with. You take things like microcredits and microloans and how they captured people's imaginations. People won Nobel Prizes about it. It became this thing that was the right thing to do. Now there's a big debate about whether making money on microcredits is actually a good thing or the right thing to do. And there's a big debate about it. Can you make money off the poor? And I think that's a real tricky challenge for this debate. We're trying to solve a global good, right? So we're trying to do something that we ultimately think is in the greatest benefit of the poorest and least franchised people in society. The impacts of climate change will be felt around the world, but we will have a much better ability to deal with it simply because we have alternates. We have resources at our hands to deal with it. I can buy bottled water if I want to, if the river runs dry. So ultimately, our hope is that these technologies are going to help the people who can least afford changes in climate. But they are never going to be at the table. They're not at the table here today, although I don't fault this conference for doing that, just simply because of where it is and how it's set up. But that will continue, throughout. And so I think for me, that's really the biggest challenge with what we're going to try and do. I'll end by just sort of giving you a little personal story. And when we talk about climate and climate change, we talk in these very big abstractions. But it is, I think, useful to meet someone and have someone in your life that reminds you that climate change, as it happens, really does impact someone's life in a very real and material way. And I don't mean an abstraction. I mean actually have a connection to a person. So I was inspired by the two of you spending a month in a tent in the Arctic. And I had a similar experience a couple of years ago. And I was in a little village called Kaktovik, which is in Anwar in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I spent several days actually hunting caribou with a Nupiaq Eskimo elder by the name of Archie Archivina. And Archie is quite a famous guy. People have written stuff about him, and he was 72 at the time, so I don't know, 75 now. And he's a whaling captain. And that is the most august position to hold in an Eskimo community. That and basketball, believe it or not. If you're a basketball player or you're a whaling captain, you're treated really well by the rest of the community. And what a whaling captain does is that he goes out on boats and he hand throws a harpoon into a 60-foot, northern right whale, which is, bowheaded whale, which is a pretty impressive thing to do. And Archie does this, and it's his job to take the fleet out there, and they're very small boats, through the ice, and then bring them back safely. So these people are held in reverence. And Archie showed me his ice cellar, which is a cellar that's been in his family since he was a little kid. He doesn't actually know when it was built. But it's essentially a cellar that is chipped out of the permafrost. And it's deep, and you descend it by ladder, and once you go inside it, it's a room, and it's filled with meat. It's meat for the whole community: walrus, seal, geese, whale, and so on and so forth. Well, last year, the year that I was there, this is again a couple of years ago, he said to me, you know what happened in September? This thing just melted out. And I lost about half of my provisions for the extended community, a lot of people who ultimately rely on him. And then he said, look what's happening now. And this was, I think, August. I think it was September. And we went to a corner of it, and there's a pool of water. It was dripping. And he's going to have to deal with the same thing. So I looked at this, and I emerged from it, and we walked over to his little cabin, and I said, so what are you going to do now? And I'm not kidding you, he points to a GE freezer that is sitting outside of his cabin, waiting to come inside. And, you know, it struck me that we really are selling, you know, freezers to the Eskimos. You know, this is it. That he's doing this that way. But when I see Archie and I see, you know, his life, and I have that connection to this individual who is actually experiencing this change, it really brings it down to me that I feel bad, I feel wretched about saving them by essentially saving my lifestyle, which is ultimately what we are discussing here.
Thank you, Sanjayan. So here's a theoretical question to introduce the next speaker. What if the first effort to attempt any of these geoengineering schemes goes horribly awry? What does that do in the public perception, the political debate, to future discussions about geoengineering? Our next speaker thinks that whoever does it first, country or individual, they ought to do it right, and has some more thoughts about that. We're really honored today to have Thomas Schelling. Mr. Schelling is a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Maryland. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist and the author of several books, including Strategy of Conflict, Arms and Influence, Micromotives, and Macro Behavior, and many more. He has worked in Washington in various capacities, from the implementation of the Marshall Plan to arms control in the 1960s, and in 1980 was first asked by Jimmy Carter to attend a summit in Venice on the carbon dioxide problem. So he has just a wonderful range of experiences and perspectives on international negotiation and a long-standing interest in climate. Mr. Schelling?
Thank you. Do I have to turn it on?
No, it's on.
Is it working?
No. All right. I'm going to try mine.
I have really one proposition, and that is that when some field experiments take place, the way they are done will have a very powerful influence on how any actual deployment might be done. And in the era of field experiments, we will be hoping to establish appropriate precedents in terms of consultation, collaboration, technique. See, I think field experiments are very important to happen soon, because if solar radiation management is a very bad idea, the sooner we discover that, the better. There are an awful lot of people who worry that talking about solar radiation management discourages efforts at mitigation. And I'm afraid they have a point. And if it should turn out that solar radiation management is a bad idea, then I think those of us who look forward to it as a savior in an emergency can stop thinking about it that way. Now, I think of two kinds of field experiments. Let me call them little ones and big ones. Big ones would be experiments to find out how effective it's likely to be. How to evaluate the likely consequences of deploying at full scale some solar radiation management. And I call this big because it means it has to be big enough to have measurable effects. And measuring the effects is not going to be easy because climate is not a constant. If it turns out that rain more in one place means less rain in another, it's going to take a decade to find out whether that is more than just an annual episode. I think of small field research as having to do with a question like what came up earlier. How many guns does it take to fire how many shells up into the stratosphere? And somebody referred to what sizes of particles might be most effective. And the question also is, can you localize solar radiation management and focus it on a vulnerable place like the Arctic without its having global consequences? Another is, does it matter where you loft this stuff into the air? Does the circulation in the stratosphere mean that no matter where you originally launch it, it gets distributed pretty much the way carbon dioxide gets distributed all over the globe? And that has to do with such things as, can you launch something from the equatorial Pacific, or do you have to launch something over China if you want to influence the climate of China? And I think the small scale is a little less frightening to people than the large scale, and therefore it might be that we can get started on that sooner if we think field experiments are important. Now, I've been working with a group that Jane Long is a co-chair of, working with a few people from her committee, and we've tried to think of what are the questions we need to ask that we would like to see answered, and we haven't been able to get around to trying to answer them. But one of the kinds of questions is, where is going to be the locus of authority and activity in the United States? If we're going to consult foreign governments, who does the consulting? Is this for the State Department? Is it for the Energy Department? Is it for the White House Office of Science and Technology? Or might it be for the National Academy of Sciences or some other private group? Who should essentially take the lead? And since presumably all of those pertinent agencies will have a say in the matter, this is more like identifying who will lead the diplomatic effort than who will actually conduct it. Then the question is, whom do we consult? Individual nations? UN agencies? If we consult with individual nations, do we consult with them individually, or do we identify a group of important nations with whom to consult and consult collectively together? Can we identify a UN agency or other agency that looks as if it would be a productive venue in which to do the consulting? And then what do we consult about? Do we simply notify that people know what our plans are? Do we try to seek permission? If so, whose permission? And what kind of permission? We could seek simply permission to go ahead and do what we have in mind, meaning no objection. Or we may need overflight rights, partly in order to monitor the results. We may need overflight rights depending on where we want to release the sulfur or whatever it is. We want cooperation and collaboration. I don't think if we are the United States, I don't think we need financial help. David Keith took care of that part of it. But we may want a cooperative effort in monitoring and evaluating the results, because the results are going to be easily disputed, particularly results in the first year or two. We can get 2 different years as different as last year was from the year before, and therefore evaluating and publicizing an evaluation is going to be a difficult thing. Anybody, of course, can evaluate. Any private citizen, any government can do its own evaluating, but we may want to ask collaboration at that stage because it may help lend credibility to our evaluation if we have various partners. It seems to me that this is bound to have an influence if at some stage either the United States or China or doubtfully the European Union or somebody wants to proceed, we may have established a precedent for how to go about seeking some kind of, if not permission, at least acquiescence, or in some cases, help. And I propose that the United States should try to get its act together soon and begin consultation about field experiments. That means having an idea of what the experiments are we want to do, and I don't know how long that would take, but I think I have a hunch that partly because of the work that Jane Long and others have been doing, we're likely to have a more, shall I say, sophisticated attitude in the U.S. government as to how to go about establishing precedents for the way solar radiation management should be governed if we ever go in for deploying actual solar radiation management. I've raised a lot of these questions. I don't have answers to them. It may be that when this report comes out, we will have attempted answers to some of them. But what I mainly want to get across is the idea that field experiments are going to be essential, and the way they are conducted is likely to have a powerful influence on what we've been calling the governance in the event of actual deployment. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Jane Long. Jane is the Associate Director of the Energy and Environment Directorate at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California.
No.
No?
Not
no.
anymore.
Oh, okay, sorry. Jane will introduce herself.
I'm the Associate Director at Large.
Okay, excellent. Sometimes science research happens in a black box with the public not really engaged in the process of research until the lab results are final. One thing that I've asked Jane to talk about is how in a case like geoengineering where there's already such high political tensions and interest, that can't happen. There has to be a public dialogue that occurs alongside research in some way. And she'll tell you a little bit more.
Well, the problem of geoengineering, the fundamental thing about geoengineering, in my view, is that it involves intentional action. And this intentionality, this intention is not something that we really know how to do. As a global community, we accept the idea of unintentional management. A recent Royal Society review of people's opinions about geoengineering had a very remarkable ending statement where people felt that the very dangerous climate change that we had caused over the last 100 years was regrettable, but that intentional modification of the climate to fix that was horrifying. And that intentionality really governs everything that we have to talk about. That is the central core. And what it begs is two key questions. What is it, and who are we? And that drives, those two questions drive the problems that we have in trying to understand where to go with this problem. So when we take it apart, what is it? Is it going to be something like Brad described, where we take into account the whole impact of our actions and look at this in a holistic, global way? Or is it going to be a very focused, targeted action to fix something that we just see wrong and get it done? And then from the management side of it, who are we? Is it going to be a top-down thing where somebody takes control and pulls the trigger, or is it going to be an emergent thing where various actors all around the world do something here or there? So this tension between what is it and who are we plays out in whether or not we think this is urgent or whether we think the best action, the best course for us is to be cautious. And the tension between urgency and caution has played out in our committee in every arena that we've looked at. The tension between needing to focus, get something done, find out if SRM is really a good technology, or the cautiousness of saying, even if we found out if it was a good technology, if we haven't built the public engagement in this problem and the public support of the science, and the public actually driving what some of the science is so that they own the results. If we haven't done that, then we'd never be able to get permission to do this anyway. And so this tension between urgency and caution plays out everywhere. I'd like to talk about 3 different arenas that I think come about in geoengineering that in a way are the could end up being the silver lining. What's next in geoengineering? I think it's research. And in the way that we do this research, we have to address these 3 things, and we have to address the tension between caution and urgency in these 3 things in a way that may become productive for our entire future. The first is setting goals. You cannot do geoengineering, you can't design an intervention unless you know what it's trying to achieve. So we've never set goals. The only goal that we've ever set from an environmental perspective in the world is to go back to nature. But we can't go back to nature anymore. I mean, we have now emitted an amount of carbon dioxide which is going to be in the air, in the atmosphere, hundreds of years. We can't go back to where we were for hundreds of years, and it's essentially not going back. So since we can't go back, how are we going to decide where we want to go? That question is so central to geoengineering that it forces us to have that conversation, and it forces us to have it in 2 ways. One way which respects the urgent side of the problem, and the other way that respects the cautious side of the problem. The urgent side of the problem is the problem you hear about, where we're going to talk about what happens if we have an emergency, and the cautious side is how do we build public support and public understanding and public engagement in this problem so that we're having conversations about multiple goals and multiple kinds of places that we want to go and finding where the common ground is. This isn't an easy problem. Let's take a look at the climate issue. There's a growing desire, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, to embrace the 2-degree goal. This, from a scientific perspective, is not a meaningful goal. Why? Because Mother Nature says whether it's going to be 2 degrees or not. We may have already passed that. And we can only control what we do. We can't control what Mother Nature does. And what we do is emit. So a meaningful goal is not to emit. But people can't understand that goal. So there's a big tension between what the public can find as a meaningful goal and what science can find as a meaningful goal. And trying to bridge that gap is going to be part of this conversation. There's another story that I love to tell, which is about goals for climate that have succeeded and why they succeeded, and it gives you some insight on what kinds of things you have to do. There are 50% of the states in this country that have renewable portfolio standards, and they have them because in each one of those states there are people who really care about limiting the amount of carbon that goes into the air, and there are people who really care about having economic development in their state. They want those new businesses in the state. And there are people who, like in Nevada, don't want to be subject to California's energy crisis anymore, and they want to have secure energy sources in their state. Those 3 groups are all served by renewable portfolio standards. But environmentalists find this very uncomfortable because what they really want is a low-carbon standard. But the minute they try to change it to a low-carbon standard, which would really evaluate what they want to get done, they lose the other 2 constituencies. So this political balance between people's goals for different objectives is going to have to, that dialogue is going to have to take place and will come to a very sharp focus, I think, when it comes to geoengineering. The second kind of activity that we need to do is we need to choose actions. As a world, we need to, as a globe, we need to have chosen actions that are strategic in terms of our environment, not just climate, but our environment. That begs a whole bunch of questions. One, what are our options? Which is one reason why we feel urgent about research. And 2, who gets to decide? And that question, which is probably more likely to be an emergent phenomena than a top-down, begs the question of norm building. So if we have technological options coming forward, we have now got to bring them forward in a way that people are able to act on them. In our climate science, we basically developed climate science and threw it over the transom to the public who couldn't swallow it. We need to be building this science in a way that people are going to ask the questions, or be involved in asking the research questions, so that when those questions get answered, they own those answers and they can use them in helping to make decisions. This activity in geoengineering research is probably enabled, in a sense, because geoengineering is so outrageous and so requiring of this kind of interaction with the public, because it's a risky endeavor in a way that we hadn't seen in climate science. So we have this as an opportunity to engage people in the problem and learn how to make these kind of very difficult choices. The last one is management. There's no way in which we know what's going to happen. In fact, that's the whole driver for doing geoengineering research right now. Nobody knows what's going to happen with climate. It's a huge uncertainty. These uncertainties aren't going to go away. This is, as Brad was saying this morning, it's a complex system. We can't predict how it's going to behave. We can neither predict how the world is going to behave in a physical and biological, chemical sense, nor can we predict how society is going to feel about this. And one of the key issues, for example, is whether society will turn around and see this as a panacea for climate, and therefore this whole thing the whole endeavor is a moral hazard. We have to have a better way to manage under this uncertainty, and it means that we have to build institutions that are going to be capable of handling that kind of management. And we're going to have to do that from the bottom up and from the top down, with urgency and with caution. And that issue about how you do this has only been solved, and has only a very few examples exist. My favorite is the Swedish nuclear waste program, which was absolutely involved in building an adaptive management program, so that as new information came up and new information came available about what the technical situation was and how it would change what their management decisions were, they had a formalized process which absolutely regularly required us as the scientists to make predictions, to compare those predictions to reality, to change our models about what was going to happen as a result, and formally bring this information to the management, who would then change their direction. And furthermore, the Swedish nuclear waste program did the social engagement and did the management of buy-in from the people. So now they are getting ready to build a repository. And you can contrast that with a U.S. nuclear waste program, which spent $10 billion, I think an order of magnitude more money, that decided on the waste on the site based on a backroom political maneuver, where 49 I used to live in Nevada, so it was called the Screw Nevada Bill. It was a bill that put waste there without any consultation, and then created the standards that the site would be judged for, and published them after the license application was filed. So we had it completely backwards in this country, but Sweden was able to do it correctly. So there are examples of people managing adaptively. We just have to learn how to scale that up. This management and the sense is going to be definitely on the side of caution, of working through the problem in a very coherent, step-by-step way. And if we don't remember that this caution has to be part of the equation, and we stick only to the urgent side, I think we'll end up having to be urgent. There won't be any choice. On the other hand, if we begin this cautious evaluation of how people can come together on goals, how people can come together on making decisions, and how people can manage under uncertainty, the silver lining is that we'll be developing societal capacities that will transcend this entire problem of geoengineering. And I think that is the most exciting thing about what can happen as we set up a research program. We can set it up so that we build in the capacities to learn to set goals, to learn to make choices, and to learn to manage under uncertainty. So that's why I'm interested in this topic. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jane. I just have one question for the panelists, and I'm going to throw it open to the floor for about 10 minutes of questions. what time frames are we thinking in terms of finding answers to any of these questions? And I know there's a lot of ways to spin that, but we've been talking about all these looming questions. How soon do we have to start figuring some of them out?
Well, I think that technologies, from a technology perspective, some of the key technologies that are being talked about are exactly the same as the key unknowns in climate science. So, for example, we talk about the role of clouds in climate science and the role of aerosols in climate science, and these are probably two of the biggest unknowns, most difficult to do. Climate science modeling proceeds by doing something called parameterization, where you lump together all the little things that are happening into one big number, and you allow that number to describe the overall effect. It's very difficult to do with a very complex dynamic system, and these two arenas in aerosols, different aerosols have different effects, and same aerosols have different effects at different times in different places, and these are really difficult problems. So I'd say we're decades, and we will never have a perfect understanding, but we will have a better understanding. The hope in that arena, and the hope for all of this in terms of being able to predict it, is pattern analysis, and we're increasingly better at that. For example, if you have a global warming that's caused by the sun getting stronger or something like that, the whole atmosphere would heat up. But because the lower atmosphere heats up and the upper atmosphere cools, we know that's a fingerprint of the radiation coming in and not being able to get out.
Right.
So that is a pattern. We have another kind of pattern, which is called a teleconnection, which is, does the Arctic ice being melted actually cause a drought in Atlanta? Is there some connection between what happens here and what happens there? Right. And those aspects of climate science are the next challenge of climate science. And I think those are critical to any geoengineering technology, because if you produce the key to geoengineering being able to be a real technology is to know whether what you do has some effect that you want. And so that causing that, developing this understanding of patterns and teleconnections is going to be critical.
Right. What's your sense, Mr. Schelling, in terms of what kind of time we have to see a successful or well-managed field experiment before we see a horrendously managed field experiment?
Because of the variability of weather from year to year, I think it'll be very hard to draw any conclusions from 1, 2, or even 3 years of experiment.
Right.
And so that I would say that once we got started with experimenting on a sufficient scale to make a noticeable difference, then I would say as the decade progresses, we'll know more and more and more. How soon we would discover that this is a dreadful idea, or how soon we would discover that the winner-loser difference isn't going to be as great as we might have thought, the better off we'll be. But I don't see how you could really reach believable conclusions in much less than a decade. But that also relates to the question, who's going to draw the conclusions?
Right.
Because everybody will be interested in drawing his or her own conclusions.
Right. Dan and Sanjian, do you have thoughts about sort of first steps in terms of international negotiations, ripping up old international laws because no one follows them anyway?
In terms of the timescales, I think the first two scenarios I was discussing, the premature rejection, the insufficient research, those are shorter-term timescales we need to be addressing. The individual or government deploying, is a longer-term timescale, and I would agree very much with what Tom says in terms of thinking about how the governance of the deployment takes place. The precedents that are set during the research stage may be more powerful in some ways than trying to negotiate an international regime, which I think is going to be very difficult, if not impossible to do. I think in the short term, the way it's going to be addressed, and probably even in the longer term, is much less through the negotiation of some new regime, but through the sort of slow, incremental coverage of some of these different techniques by existing regimes. So we already see this with ocean fertilization, with the London Convention, biodiversity. If solar radiation management starts going, it's, I think, more likely to be addressed under existing regimes like the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention or maybe the Montreal Protocol. They're not exactly relevant, but I tend to think it'll be much more through incremental adaptation of those regimes than through and it could start taking place sooner rather than later, take place that way rather than through the negotiation of some brand new UN agency.
Right. Sanjayan?
No, I agree.
Okay, great. Because time is limited, I think I'll take maybe 3 questions and then have folks answer. So raise your hand and please identify yourself. Any questions? Okay, there. Here. First.
It's Joel Darmstadter from Resources for the Future. A very quick one to Jane. She assertively dismisses the legitimacy of the 2-degree marker that some fairly respectable folks have embraced. Most recently, I guess, the World Bank, in its World Development Report last December. And the second question, perhaps to Tom or others, is given the time scale of meaningful results, even from a field trial, are there other we always talk about the necessity, and so we're not reflexively about the necessity for a portfolio of options and things, but are there 1 or 2 major technologies which could be researched concurrently with the field trial of an entirely different sort that could perhaps provide meaningful results for climate mitigation, CO2 reduction over the same, perhaps a shorter period? One that comes to mind is microwave relay of electricity from orbiting satellites, which I think no longer begs for scientific legitimacy, but there are all kinds of other questions, some of them relating to governance, which would arise in that as well. There may be other, like the biomass.
Great, thanks, sir.
Sorry.
Sean, can you bring to the person in the back who also had their hand raised?
Hi, my name is Sky Shields with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. I'm wondering, why the focus on, this seems like a bigger Band-Aid fix than something that would involve actually changing the cycles we know exist in the biosphere. Like, for instance, I'm working right now on a project called the North American Water and Power Alliance, which would take a large quantity of excess runoff water from Alaska and Canada and bring that down to green the Great American Desert that's shared between North America and Mexico. We know the effect we know major things about the water cycle, about the energy cycle, the effect of increasing the amount of forestation in deserts to increase synthesis on those areas. Can I be heard?
Okay, yep. I think we have your question. Thank you, sir. One more, Sean. This fellow right here. Yep.
Thank you. Günther Hörmandinger. I'm the Environment Councillor for the EU delegation here. And that's maybe why I feel a little defensive about the 2-degree target, because that's a European target that made it to the world stage. But I don't think anybody is under any illusion that we can actually act to achieve it. But the idea is, of course, if you've anchored a high-level target like that at the top political level, then you will have derivative targets that guide the operational aspects. And if you don't have the large target, you won't have the others either. So that's where it comes from. And so I think in defense of that kind of targeting.
Right.
Okay, great, thanks. All right.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I think I probably said I probably need to dig myself out of a hole here, but the 2-degree target is clearly meaningful politically. It's catching on. I mean, I think it's meaningful in that sense, but it has difficulties from a scientific perspective. So it puts you my point was really that in finding goals, you have a problem, because if you find one that's politically meaningful but has scientific difficulty, then you have to have these derivative goals, and that becomes the focus, and you have to focus on whether the derivative goals are meaningful. So my point was just to talk about how hard it is to have goals that are meaningful across the board, and to have goals that people agree on for the same reason. Those were my 2 points.
I also think, is this on? Yeah. To me, a main problem with the 2-degree goal, aside from the fact that I can't find it's based on anything, is that as the decades go by, we won't know whether we're on track to reach a stable point at 2 degrees centigrade, if I may call it that for Jason, because I think the has been called the thermal inertia, especially of the oceans, means that the equilibrium temperature may take half a century to reach, and therefore, along about the year 2030, 2035, if we're in a dispute about how well we're doing toward stabilizing at 2 degrees, nobody will have a good answer. Or people may have answers, but nobody will have a good answer.
Did anyone want to respond to another facet of the first question? No? Okay, do we have time for... Okay, great. More questions? Up, right, second row.
Caitlin Antrim, working on Law of the Sea. There's a case before the International Seabed Tribunal dealing with liability for actions affecting the oceans as a whole. I don't want to address that part, but it did come up in there that, as in the Rio Declaration, the role of environmental impact statements is not just a national responsibility, but a responsibility of nations for anything that has a major impact on the environment. So I thought I'd ask Dan if he sees that as something that would be a key part of this, of having to explain what a country planned on doing, either the country or its citizens, before it could move ahead, not necessarily to get permission, but to make sure that it was fully debated in a wide audience.
Okay, right, Sean, right behind you, in the center aisle.
Martin Apple. I'm going to address this mostly to Dr. Schelling. If we go ahead on any kind of scale, your assumption is that we can pull back if it doesn't work. What if that's not true? What if what we start doing cascades in a way that we can't pull back?
Great, thanks. One more, right here.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I'm glad that you're discussing this modus operandi of trying any of these projects. If they are small and insignificant, probably those will have some kind of committee. But if it's a major one, it'll be run by a government, and there you probably will have to learn by errors, by making mistakes, and that will take about a decade or more. And just like the Egyptian dam, Aswan Dam and its problems, and then it'll get politicized, or Americans calling it a big disaster, the Russians calling it a great success.
Great, thanks. Dan, why don't you start with the Law of the Sea question?
Well, thanks. I think it's broader than the Law of the Sea question. So it's the idea in international environmental law of doing environmental impact assessments. And I think, yes, definitely. I mean, I think the requirement is for countries to do national environmental impact assessments. There's also international treaty, but it's on a regional level on doing environmental impact assessments internationally. But I think in either case, countries engaging in geoengineering research should be and are likely to be doing environmental impact assessments as part of their decision-making process nationally about whether to go ahead. That doesn't mean that there'll be any international decision-making process, but there'll be at least that kind of consideration of all the different impacts, not just on the climate system, but all the other ecosystem effects.
Great. Mr. Schelling, did you have a response to the question about what if we can't pull back?
Yes, I thought the evidence was pretty good that if we used sulfur aerosols in the stratosphere, they wouldn't stay more than a year or 2 or 3. I think Pinatubo has been mentioned. It cooled the Earth significantly for a very few years. Way back, I think about 1815, a mountain called Tambora erupted in what is now what used to be, I think, the Dutch East Indies. It led to what was referred to as the summer that never came. Lakes in New Hampshire and Vermont remained frozen over for a whole year. Presumably, that was the Pinatubo effect. But even that drastic thing didn't last more than a very few years. So I don't think what we've been talking about should be classed as irreversible, unless something could happen so drastic within a year that you wished you could take a vacuum cleaner up there and get rid of the stuff. But I think the Pinatubo effect suggests that if you can afford to wait a year or two, you reverse it. David, isn't that about right?
There are lots of unknowns and things that could go wrong, but the things that seem most irreversible in people dying typically involve things that replicate. So releasing monkeys into Hawaii, or they're carcinogens that have a very long time delay. These are the classic cases where we've been over-optimistic about technology and can't go back. The way the stratosphere works, it seems less likely that that's true. I'm more worried about a lock-in of human cultural response. It will become dependent on it, not that it will make a natural, irreversible.
But I mean, one irreversible impact could be extinctions of certain things. So you could have a couple of years of a relatively short-term effect, like Mount Pinatubo, for example, which might not significantly impact our lifestyles, but it could clearly take certain things and make them extinct because they're already on the brink, and so you have, a reproductive cycle that is interrupted or a migration pattern that's interrupted, and that's certainly one irreversible one.
Well, yeah, but my point is this is pulling the climate back closer in general, not everywhere, to what it was before we messed with it.
Great. Well, on that note, I think we can pick up this conversation after lunch. We have about 15 minutes. Please, guys, go and grab a box lunch outside. Don't sit there too long, and we'll have our keynote speaker in about 15 minutes. Thanks.
If you think about it, species that's